Welcome back. I want to spend a little bit more time on these constructor functions because they are a little bit tricky. There's a lot of magic happening here, so let's make sure that we fully get this. Let's play around with this functionality. If I console.log here, this, and see what this is, and I run, I see that this is the elf object that we're creating. But there's no properties on here because, well, we haven't added anything. It just creates an empty object. However, if I bring this down here and I do console log, I see that after we construct this elf and add properties to it, we have them accessible to us. Now, the interesting thing here is that if I do something like variable a equals 5, and I click run here, it's not going to add this to our elf object. With a constructor function, the only way we can add properties to this object is to use the this keyword. All right, and then we also talked about how constructor functions automatically create that prototype chain for us. So let's test that out. If in here, instead of Peter.attack, I'm going to do, let's say, Peter __ proto, let's see what I get. I get elf attack function. Let's comment this out for a second, just so we can see it without the prototype. All right, we see that we have elf as our prototype. So remember, proto points to the prototype of elf. So it points to elf.prototype. And elf.prototype was created for us because of this new keyword. So that when we finally add onto the prototype an item like attack, well, I now have proto pointing to elf.prototype, which contains the attack method. So if I do elf here dot prototype and I run this, you see that that's the same thing. We have the attack function inside of this prototype. If I console log this before we add the prototype, well, it's an empty object. And remember, every function that we create gets this prototype property, but only constructor functions actually have use for this prototype object. Now, just to finalize our understanding, what happens if I do console.log elf or Peter.prototype? What do you think this will result in? If I click run, I get undefined. Why is that? Well, because Peter is not a function. Peter is an object, and only functions have access to the prototype. By the way, one of the biggest gotchas with this is if we add something like, let's say, build. And build is simply going to return house. So if I do Peter build now, see that Peter has built a house. But let's say that instead, let's do this. Let's say we have a function called building, and this function is going to return house. And let's say in here it'll be this dot name builds a house. Let's make sure we add them together here. And then finally, we can just call building here. What do you think happens if I build now? If I click run, I get undefined. And yes, I'm being repetitive here, but hopefully by showing you these things a few times, you really internalize them. Why do we get undefined? Well, this is one of the biggest gotchas when it comes to object-oriented programming, when we create objects like this. Functions inside of methods is, well, a function inside of a function. That means this is not assigned to the object itself, but actually to the window object. And we've seen this before. So there's a few ways to solve that. You can do bind this, or remove the call of the function and just return the function. So now we can call it Peter builds a house. Or even easier, if we go back, we can just have a reference such as self equals this, and this can be turned into self. So that if I run this, and we have to make sure that we return this, we get Peter built a house. Awesome. All right, let's remove this and go back to what we had before. Let's remove that as well. Now that we have things clean, what is the problem with this? Are we there? Are we at object-oriented programming nirvana? Did we reach our end goal? Well, not really. The problem with this code is prototype is kind of weird. It's a little hard to understand, isn't it? And I mean, it looks kind of ugly. This code is not very understandable unless you really know your prototypal inheritance and how JavaScript works, which most people don't. This can get very confusing very fast. As a matter of fact, there's not that many people that like this style of coding. It's kind of confusing. Although older code bases, you might see a lot of this, especially if they're doing object-oriented programming. But the problem is that object-oriented programming is all about the idea of classes. This code, well, there's no classes in here. There's this weird thing where we have to make sure to remember to have a capital letter, which is why object.create was added to the language in order to avoid this headache and just use pure prototypal inheritance. But the thing is, this style of coding, this idea of this and the new keyword, is very much object-oriented programming inspired, especially when it comes to languages like Java. If we wanted to get closer to object-oriented programming, well, object.create is technically less object-oriented than something like this. But like I said before, this is not pretty. So how can we improve this? And we're going to improve this a lot. In the next part, we're finally going to get to the end, to our goal of adding classes and doing true, or as close as we can with JavaScript, object-oriented programming. Let's find out what that looks like in the next video.